Thank you, Mantha, again.
Thank you very much all for being here. Um, I should first and foremost say that this was a common joint project with Simon Richards, who is sitting, next to Dimitris Philippides. But before, I move on, I will just say that my name is Mantha Zarmakoupi, a classical archaeologist and architectural historian. This is Dimitris Philippides, an architectural historian and urban theorist. Simon Richards, an architectural historian. Thomas Doxiadis, a landscape architect and practitioner, and also theoretical thinker. And Mark Wigley, a professor of architectural history and theory, and one of the first persons outside Greece who was interested in to bring back the focus on Doxiadis. But as I said, the book that you have received and all you will receive and will soon arrive in this location from, we have it stored to be protected from the elements. It will soon be here. It was a joint project that started by Simon and me some 10 years ago when we started thinking about looking back at this moment in time in the 60s and 70s and linking it to concerns today. So how these discussions really started then at the aftermath of the modern movement and this moment of thinking about the future of the city then and bringing it back to focus today was our interest was to see how much the discussions that we're having today have a historical depth. Things, we tend to see these problems as very pressing and urgent of the now, but, they have a historical depth and this moment in time in the 60s and 70s, that's precisely the moment. So at this point, I will invite first, the first speaker will be Dimitris Philippides, who himself worked for Doxiadis at that time. And of course, he's worked in both offices in Athens and in the States, and he has a deep thinking and he's written a book on Doxiadis. Some historical context of Doxiadis, he's an urban planner, he's an architect by training, and he is creating these discussions. There is an intersection with the theme of the Alpha Mission that, this is the sanctuary of Apollo, and it's basically here, that they're coming and to see and seek, this future of settlements, looking at the past and see how that model of the past can be fed into the future. At the same time, the Apollo mission happens, so there are discussions that revolve around what are we doing now as we're going to the moon. So this is an interesting intersection with the discussion of today and the Alpha mission and the Artemis mission. But that's, something that we can develop throughout the discussion. And so Dimitris first will speak about this moment and provide us the unique context that he can, being somebody who has a deep knowledge of the subject. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mantha. I think you said everything I wanted to say, so I can go home peacefully. Still, I think I have an obligation to speak. As one of the few remnants of the Doxiadis organization in the past, for whom I worked for 6 years, 3 in Athens, as Mantha mentioned, and another 3 in Detroit for another very ambitious project called the Great Lakes Megalopolis that covered the entire top of the United States. Anyway, I have to talk about Doxiadis. I'm sure that some of you have heard something about him, but there's still a lot of things to learn about him, and that's what I found out when I entered his archive, which is dutifully preserved in Athens. Not suspecting what I'll find, I thought it would be an easy job which could be completed in a number of months. It took me 5 years. And those 5 years ended in a very heavy volume, which nobody read. But still, while I felt that I paid my obligations to Doxiadis, On the other hand, I still think that Doxiadis is unknown. When I said that I'm obliged to Doxiadis, I mean not only somebody who gave me the first job I had in my life, but somebody who taught me in a number of ways, directly and indirectly, about how one can go around professionally in his life, what to expect, what his dreams can be, and what can he expect as a conclusion at the end. Doxiadis had a very wonderful life, actually. Although his life was shortened by a terrible disease at the end, and he died at the age of 63, by the time he had managed to become a world celebrity, a financial success, a planner who would be recognized all over the world, and more than anything else, somebody who was a good manager. And this was something that was completely missing at the time. Unless we take this into consideration, we cannot understand how he went around in his life. Because he was ambitious, of course he was ambitious. He was successful, of course he was successful. But what did he leave behind him? Was it a personal triumph that once he died went away like a whiff of air? Or was it something that left something behind? To answer those kinds of questions, one has to go back and try to figure out how Doxiadis actually thought, because we have a very good records of his thoughts, not only his projects. Early in his life, Doxiadis determined that what really matters in life is order. Order, discipline, logic, and those things are connected to mathematics. So Doxiadis, in his life, even starting from his dissertation in Berlin in 1934-36, published in 37, he was dealing with understanding antiquity, this world, the world we are immersed today, in his as a model, as a mathematical model. So it wasn't a matter of emotional, aesthetic, figurative, abstractional, whatever you want, you can think, but it was a matter of a formulation of application of mathematics. Once you start with this principle, then it's easy to go further on, because having to gain his living, Doxiadis became a planner. At a time that planning wasn't the way it is today. There were, of course, a lot of people, planners in various countries. There were a lot of projects being carried on all around the world, developed and or underdeveloped at the time. But Doxiadis brought something new in this discussion. And what he brought was that, of course, we respect the mathematical part of it, the pure abstraction of mathematics, which in planning, for example, would be statistics. statistics which would determine, for example, how many people could Delos contain, how many houses you need to build in order to have a successful human community, and so on and so forth. He said, we need the numbers, we need the standards, we need all those principles which have to be accepted by everybody so that their value is made tangible. But on the other hand, you have to combine that. Yes, I think I exceeded my time. Can I take another hour?
Of course. I'm just flagging.
Okay, I think that I made my main point, that when Doxiadis came to Delos, he was already convinced that you need more than the mathematics, that you need this magic that is represented by the antiquity and historical settlements, etc. And only if you combine this with contemporary data and information, you can arrive at a viable planning. Thank you very much.
There will be opportunity to comment again, but we wanted to do a first round first, and Simon would now move on, of course, as a co-producer of the volume, of course, but also like contextualizing the moment for us. Thank you, Simon.
Okay, thank you, Mantha. And I'd like to follow up. The point was just made a moment ago, to give you a little bit of context of why is perhaps Doxiadis and the Delos Symposia not as well known as we, in putting the book together with all these wonderful scholars, think it really should be. And, why is it that if you open an English language anthology of architectural theory or history of the period, will you find little to no mention of this moment? Part of it is because of the way architecture and planning was going in these years, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And to put it quite simply, there was an erosion of trust in experts. The earlier part of the century was in large part characterized, if not to some degree dominated, by the international congresses of modern architecture, largely around the hugely charismatic figure, the Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier, who in 1942 said, I no longer wish to be called an architect, I wish to be called the lawgiver. And the politicians need to ask my permission if they want to do anything with the world. By the late 1950s, people were getting tired of that. Even the people associated with the International Congresses of Modern Architecture were getting tired with that. And they were pushing back against it. And even Le Corbusier said at that time, perhaps my time is up. Perhaps I'm no longer connected. And through the 1960s, we see this swell in grassroots movements, architects, planners, commentators saying we can't trust the experts anymore. We must enable people to build their own communities. We must get rid of planners and allow people to build for themselves. We must learn from popular architecture and consumerism, and so it went. And the expert was going very much out of fashion and having a hard time. Now, Doxiadis and Delos Symposia did not give up on that. They presented themselves very much as the experts with the solutions. And just to give you a sense of how they were going, one of the most iconic images from the Doxiadis and the Delos Symposia and the whole movement is a thing called the Ekistics grid. And if you can imagine a grid of 5 by 15, 5 on the long side, 5 on the short side, I beg your pardon, 15 on the long side. And on the short side, you have what are called the ekistic elements. And those are the spheres of action, the things that they wanted to fix. And they included nature, man, society, shells, and networks. Shells with a name for buildings, okay? And then on the long side, the 15 units are the scales, and you are operating, or you should operate from the scale of the individual human being, through the room, through the building, all the way up through what they call the ecumenopolis, or the totally connected networked planet. Now, if you were to project a normal architectural office onto that grid, they would occupy maybe 9 or 10 squares of activity. But there are 75 squares of activity in there, running from one point, the nature of man, through to the totally networked planet. So they were thinking at a huge scale. And that put them out of phase, if you like, with what was becoming, I think, the dominant orthodoxy of ways of thinking of architecture and planning in the 60s and 70s. Grassroots, bottom-up, more populist, and taking control away from the architect planner. So they were a little bit out of phase, and so you might say perhaps some things are forgotten for good reasons, but we don't think it is forgotten for good reasons, because in that rush for thinking of big problems, they were actually trying to solve very intimate issues. For example, if I just glance at my notes. In the beginning of a book called Human Identity in the Urban Environment, which is all about the impacts of overdevelopment and international trade, the editor, Jacqueline Tirrett, who was one of Doxiadis' great collaborators, begins by saying how her swim in the sea was spoiled because she spotted oil in the water. This was a result of overdevelopment and overtrade. And that gives you a really good insight into what they were trying to do, to tackle huge issues in order to solve things that really mattered, like being able to preserve the natural environment and enjoy the pleasure of going to swim in clean water on the beach. And shortly before he died, Doxiadis wrote an essay called The Formation of the Human Room. This was in 1972, and if you don't mind, I'll quote what he said there. He said, "People have to learn how to be very revolutionary when dealing with new systems and networks, but are very conservative when dealing with man, when dealing with people." So it was about getting together all these brilliant experts in order to solve problems of international import, natural spoiling of the environment, population migrations, forced migrations of population, and all those impacts, in order to preserve the intimate things. Swimming in the beach, bedtime stories, the pleasures of a conversation, a face-to-face conversation. But the expertise, the aura, I think, put them a little bit out of favor, and that's why I think they've been eclipsed. How am I doing for time, Mantha? A couple of minutes left? Okay. I want to move on to tell you one of the things that I think they were so fascinating about. And that is the centrality they gave to what they call the human factor, thinking about the impact of the environment upon people. And we all assume that buildings affect us, but we don't really know how. In 1912, a historian called Geoffrey Scott wrote a book called The Architecture of Humanism. And he said that this runs beneath the surface of architectural discourse, that we assume it affects behavior, but we don't really think about it very seriously in a very dedicated way. Now, what the Delos Symposia did is that they put this front and center into their deliberations, thinking about what is the nature of the human being. Do we change over time? Is there a constant core that remains universal and that we all share? And for sure, they tripped themselves up and drove themselves crazy about this in the years that they were arguing. And often very heated arguments came out of the symposia, where you would find the more practically minded contributors would say, we are wasting our time, we don't have time to work out human nature, we are not philosophers. And then the more philosophically minded contributors would say, how dare you, you can't start working on the built environment until you have a good idea of the person that you are designing for. So that's something that ran through. And as I said, they didn't obviously solve the problem of human nature. is probably unsolvable. But what I find really fascinating and commendable about them is the way they were willing to put it front and center in their agenda, and to be circumspect about jumping towards conclusions about what people are and what they need before they then went on to propose built environment solutions for them. And that is really remarkable, because after that, we don't find anything comparable in the history of architectural theory. It goes below the surface again, if you like. Now I work with, I'm not an architect, I'm an architecture historian, but I work with architects every day. And not a day goes past when someone doesn't drop the word well-being out into a conversation. And it's clear to me that no one really knows what they're saying when they're talking, when they're using that word. But it's one of the buzzwords that just keeps getting kicked around. But in the Delos Symposia, we saw it being debated very intensely and very deeply in a very committed way. And it's a really rich resource to go back into and look at and to see, you know, to sort of mine again, to see how architect, planners and others have thought about human nature, and how it might be enhanced rather than brutalized and compromised by the built environment. And oftentimes when... Am I done? Give me 30 seconds. Oftentimes when the debate did go off the rails, Constantinos Doxiadis and those closest to him would try to bring it back to earth a little bit, and they would say that, you know, we can find clues about what people need and how to live well by looking at settlements that have succeeded, and it is for that reason that they kept drawing attention back to settlements like this one, where the scale is compact and walkable, and which Doxiadis believed could lead to what Aristotle had been searching for, which is, you know, the fundamental question: what are the principles to make life safe and happy? And I'm going to stop there. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon, and also for bringing into focus, you know, something that, you know, how they centered this discussion around, you know, the past, also the study of ancient settlements and, you know, the ancient Greek cities project that he had actually spearheaded at the same time that he's organizing this this symposia. Now we're moving on to Thomas. You know, Simon focused on the human factor, one of the elements of Ekistics, but Thomas in his work, he will focus on, you know, nature, another factor that it's part of the Ekistics, you know, under the concept of Ekistics, and, you know, with his own work. So please, Thomas.
Thank you, Mantha and Alexandra, for bringing us all together here. I will talk a bit of my own experience of Dinos and his collaborators as regards the relationship to nature, and how that played out, you know, through my own viewpoint in my life, and how I came recently to re-examine the work that they were doing through what I had learned. So I am his elder brother's grandson. My memory of Dinos is when he could no longer speak, so he would pat us on the head, he would smile, but he couldn't speak. But then after he left the picture, after he died, he was everywhere, because we lived in his buildings, we lived in the village that he had designed of Apollonio. There was a lot of talk of what he and his cadre had done. And for me, I would say the 70s, which is his, you know, just as he left the picture, were a period of Apollonian bliss, in the sense that I lived in this village of Apollonia, which he created, and it was actually a very beautiful life for kids, because everything was walkable, there were no cars, people really looked out for each other, amenities were communal, which is very important for cities in general, but it's something that's being reversed right now. Then came the 80s, and my experience was of a Greece being quickly destroyed as a lot of EU money came in and things developed quickly. And they raised, in me at least, the sort of gut reaction of, well, you know, if development is caused this destruction, is there something we can do about it? Then came the 90s when I left Greece and went to college and then architecture school, and there among what are called the trays, where we were studying architecture, I saw people doing things that were much more interesting. They were dynamic, they were systemic, they were alive, and they were sort of all-encompassing, and that thing was called landscape architecture and landscape ecology. So I ended up studying. I was again very fortunate to have Richard Foreman, who was one of the founders of landscape ecology, as a professor. And this sort of holistic and systematic ecological thinking was then the basis of our practice after I came back in Greece and started working. We always felt the need, in parallel with design, to do research, perhaps another kind of subliminal remnant from the Doxiadis, from Dinos's influence. Looking at various things, for example, at the beginning of the Greek crisis, looking at Athens, which was a city in trouble, and trying to use landscape ecological principles to see how the city works, how public space works, and how we can, you know, make it better, and finding that there are things that you can actually take across disciplines and learn interesting things, and coming eventually. You know, in the back of my mind, there's always been a nagging worry, which is we practice based on certain ethics, but do we really serve those ethics, or are they a bit of a, you know, a show, the front of a shop, and then something else is happening behind? And that also, I have to say, there was a similar worry listening sometimes to people talk about Dinos as an excellent communicator, implying perhaps that the communication was there, but the actual work did not fully serve the ideals that it was purported to serve. So when Simon and Mantha came to us and said, you know, we're doing this set of workshops, and then, you know, let's look back at Doxiadis and his colleagues. We said, great, we're going to use landscape ecology, which is what we know how to do, to look at their work, and decided to look at the master plan for Skopje. This was a master plan done in 1964 to 66, after the big destruction of Skopje in the earthquake of 1963. And what we did is we researched the master plan in the archives, which, as Mr. Philippides said, is an amazing experience of itself. We placed it on Google Earth. We examined the area of Skopje, the present conditions. So we are not scholars. We could not really go back in time to see what they were thinking, but we're using now our, you know, contemporary understanding to test what they actually designed. So to see the ecological functioning of the area of Skopje, then we placed the master plan on Google Earth and started examining it for certain factors. So the first factor, looking at landscape ecology, is relationship to topography, and there it got a pass. It was actually designed to fit quite nicely with topography, and I have to say, looking back at a lot of work from the period, not only Doxiadis but many offices right after the war, there's a lot of common sense happening, and I don't know how one can conceptualize that, but it seems to us that, you know, there were many common sense solutions. Second, looking at hydrology, and we found out that they had done exactly what would be good practice today, which is to take the system of rivers and streams in the Skopje Basin and make it the center of a park system. You know, preserve it, address flooding. So flooding was identified as a problem for Skopje and was dealt with in certain ways. But we also found out that while the natural structure of the streams was followed for most of the area, in certain points they started going Cartesian, which is a very sort of Doxiadis thing to do. So we give it a partial pass, pass with a few comments, let's say. Then looking at soils, which are, again, from the contemporary perspective of landscape and ecology, are important. They were not dealt with, so that's a fail. And then sort of the actual landscape ecological system, which works with patches, which are the sort of areas, the rooms or open air rooms, or let's say larger areas that compose a natural system. And just to make a small aside, how much time do we have? 2 minutes, okay. What is landscape ecology? Basically, landscape ecology is the relationship between the spatial characteristics of an area and its ecological functions. So it gives you the tools to examine but also act upon space and ecological function. So we found out that the master plan actually had sort of very reasonably laid out different patches of different sizes, and one would assume eventually different qualities. So that was a pass. When it comes to connectivity, which is maybe the most important aspect of ecology in a territory, things were very well connected based on this hydrology system and other connections established. And we also went to Islamabad because we're looking at a master plan that was not really implemented. So we said if it had been implemented, what would we have seen? We went into Islamabad, and then we saw that as you go down in scale, the rules are followed. So it's something that works in terms of connectivity. It got a pass there. And when you look at the overall mosaic, which is how the system works in its totality, again, for the various reasons mentioned before, it worked quite well, pass with a few comments. Then looking at the contemporary idea of blue-green infrastructure or ecosystem services, what nature does for us, that was their main outlook. And therefore, the master plan was well designed in that sense. But also, there were sort of non-anthropocentric views, even though Doxiadis and his group were very interested in humans as not objects but subjects. Okay, because for many architects and planners, humans are objects of design. They were also interested in nature as a subject of design. The final test was the test of openness and the dynamics of the system. Was this a system that was designed to be able to take change? And the answer again was yes. Check. So what was interesting for us is to go back in time, 60 years, test with our contemporary understanding something that those guys were doing, find out that they were doing it pretty well, and it also brought to the surface the fact that we're all usually talking about the history of ideas, but it is people who create ideas, and it is people who are the bearers and the connectors of ideas. And that brings us back to Delos then, which is people coming together to share and to learn. And it brings us to Delos today, which is all of us being here to share and to learn. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and for also mentioning not only the Skopje plan of Doxiadis, but also the Islamabad plan, which was implemented. And, for those of you who don't know, that's a plan that actually is based on this idea of this small scale of the city of the past, like Delos or Athens, classical Athens or Praini, and the small sectors of that plan, replicate the density of a small city settlement connected through highways, with kind of like developing indefinitely across time. But that was the idea, right? Like the small model of the ancient city, and then connected through networks, with the highways and so on. But now we'll pass, the baton to Mark Wigley, who is going to comment, his early interest, but also comment on others, the speakers earlier, but also bring, his own view, what his research interest nowadays into focus with Doxiadis.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here in this very kind of flat unusually flat surface with the water just there and the hill that we just climbed on the other side. And for me, it was always a dream to be in Delos. And I've discovered that dreams quite often come true. So I'm very grateful to the World Human Forum for making this possible. But you may have made a mistake to invite me because I'm not that human, really. So, and why was dreaming about Delos? Because, of course, Doxiadis cultivated in me an enormous jealousy that I was not here in 63, 64, 65. Jealousy is an incredibly important ingredient in the production of architecture. It's almost as important as coffee. If you stop coffee, architecture stops. But jealousy comes very close afterwards. If you do not produce work that produces in your best friends, especially your best friends, a sense of jealousy, and maybe the Delos meetings were about producing a kind of jealousy, about a new kind of conversation that we would all like to participate in, a conversation with different kind of rules, different kinds of questions, and that it would happen in this sacred place. So I am a victim from New Zealand for a long time of this feeling of jealousy, and this is before we mention Marshall McLuhan and Buckminster Fuller and Margaret Mead and Conrad Waddington and so on. But I suppose I want to resist the idea that Doxiadis was a perfect person. And maybe to think a little bit about some criticisms. Firstly, why was Doxiadis not boring? And this is why I was researching him. He was absolutely not boring. In a moment of time in the 90s in which maybe actually there were many boring people organizing architectural conversations, all of whom felt that they had discovered computation, computers, data, information, it seems to me they were recycling ideas that were much more seriously discussed in the Delos meetings, and not just the Delos meetings, but also in the Institute and in the wider projects, and discussed in the projects themselves. So what was, for me anyway, this moment, and I would say this moment is more from 1958 through. It's really a kind of way of thinking coming, I would date it almost exactly in 1958 and continues through. And this is a moment in which the world is becoming smaller. So the World Human Forum is not so big, actually. It's a small project, just the world. It's not the cosmos, right? It's just the world. And in this moment of time, which is the moment of Apollo, it's the moment of dreaming of humans living beyond, moving beyond the Earth then was becoming smaller. Because one thing we can say about humans is that they really are interested in humans. I mean, this is the most self-obsessed species that you can imagine, right? And this love that the humans have for humans, it's probably a problem, right? So in this moment of time when the world is becoming smaller, Doxiadis initiates a project which, for me anyway, was a rethinking of scale. He dramatically changed the scale in which anybody involved with the built environment was thinking, and indeed the scale went to the moon and beyond. And he also rethought time. We have to think of the ancient Greek cities and so on. The criticism I would like to make is that it was already very limiting to think of an ancient Greek city as old. I mean, really, humans are an unbelievably short experiment. We are maybe coming to the end of it, but it only started maybe 200,000 years ago. And the concept of human settlement might even be more like a 5,000-year project. If you think of human settlement, those who have settled, well, even proto-cities of 5,000 years ago are now understood to be very temporarily occupied. So what is why the humans settle, and what do we learn from Doxiadis and his friends about that? We settle in order to maximize connectivity. Cities are kind of networks that produce networks that produce networks. So Doxiadis himself creates a network to think about networks, and even networks networking, right? So he's really like the king of networks in a moment in time in which networks seem like a principle or a way of understanding what it means to be together in every sense. So this kind of concept of thinking networks, this means immediately, as has been said before, that most architects are almost irrelevant. They occupy such a very small part of the responsibility. But the moment of settlement and human settlements, here's my problem with the word human settlements. Actually, probably only humans have settlements. So settlements is actually not even what humans do. Settlements are what produces humans. In other words, what emerges from new forms of connectivity, new forms of connection, which become new forms of thinking, new forms of singing, new forms of sex, new forms of eating, new forms of travel, new forms, new. This is the human. The human is the kind of product of almost a kind of strange activity, which is to settle, because the world is absolutely unsettled. It's spinning very, very fast. Any of us who settle will die. Actually, death is when things stop moving. Right? Your heartbeat stops. So when we produce settlements, which are kind of like concentrations of things that don't move, in order to produce new forms of movement, this is a very specifically, let's say, human experiment. And if we would say now, since we are on Delos, what change might there be in this experiment? Like, what would be the future direction? I would say somewhat too simplistically and too quickly here, and too rudely, since it's the World Human Forum that is I am the guest of. Maybe we should no longer be so interested in the human, or not so long interested in this human that was so pleased to produce right angles in a world in which there are no right angles. Right? So pleased to be different. And maybe it's a moment in time to understand that just as the world was getting smaller in the late 50s and through the 60s, as really dramatically represented by figures like Buckminster Fuller, and there was the question, what about life in outer space? And I think the Fuller position was, outer space is the only place you can find life. Right? This is what life is. Life is that which occupies outer space. At the end of lectures, people would ask him, say, Mr. Fuller, sir, that was a really beautiful lecture. By the way, do you believe in life in outer space? And he would say, young man, where the hell do you think you are? Right. So this kind of mindset shift, I think a similar mindset shift is absolutely urgent today. And one way to begin to think about, let's say, something other than human settlements, and maybe it means not settlement. Like maybe we need, again, to think a little bit more about unsettlement. But anyway, we are the guests, each of us, of about 100 trillion microbes. So we are ourselves, our inner world is bigger than the biggest dimension that we can imagine of the outer world, the world of outer space. I think some kind of awareness of the extent to which the human is a very, very fragile, short-lived experiment which has blinded itself to the deeply collaborative and highly connected nature of nature, right? And I think it's interesting that there were mathematicians and astronomers, biologists in the late 19th century that really reflected a lot upon that. And I think in some kind of imaginary Delos of the future, if we could choose which 20 figures that we might bring in from the past, I would love that Lynn Margolis would come here and speak what she was saying in 1967 about the extent to which we are inseparable from our collaborations with microbes, some of the great scientists of the late 19th century who were for the first time arguing that obviously, life arrived on Earth from outer space. And that concept, that life came to Earth from outer space, was the subject of intense debate in 1958. And that's why I would say 1958 is the year. And exactly it was thought that if we go to the moon, we will screw everything up. Because either we will take our bacteria to the moon, or we would bring the bacteria back from the moon, or the bacteria in the bodies of the astronauts would mutate and come back differently. But most importantly, if we contaminated the moon, we would no longer know whether life came from outer space, right? So I think it's very possible, out of respect for Doxiadis, out of love for Doxiadis, to challenge some of the assumptions of Delos and really re-ask the question and magnify the scale, take the scale further back, go at least 10,000 years back and look at the very beginnings, the very first moments that humans invented themselves as humans by inventing what we now call architecture. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think that each one of the participants of this panel are trying to bring a depth in the discussion from the past to the future, and how these discussions were relevant then, what they were important, and why then they are interesting, and why together we're revisiting them, but what are their limitations, and so how can we relate to the questions of today, something that we'll be focusing mostly tomorrow, of course, but of course the floor is open for questions, please.
I would like to comment on the last speaker's really expansive views of the universe and of the micro-universe. You say we have 100 trillion microbes that we collaborate with and make life possible for humans, which is bigger than the dimension of the universe per se. That's not true because there are about 2 trillion galaxies in the universe, 2 times 10 to the 12 zeros, right? And then each galaxy contains about anywhere from 100 to 400 billion stars. That's another 9 zeros. So we're already 21 zeros. And various estimates on the basis of exoplanetary systems here in our own galaxy is that there are about 40 billion planets in the habitable region around stars in our own galaxy. So I think we are a lot smaller than the universe, but I certainly agree that we're part of this big picture, and there could be trillions and trillions of habitable planets, although I don't believe we will ever find out.
Yeah, it was very beautiful what you said, and that you layered it. It slowly was more and more. For me, the number 100 trillion is impossible for me to understand. And probably all the other numbers that you mentioned, I cannot understand. But not understanding it, not knowing what it means to be the guest of 100 trillion microbes, which are living and dying, so it's every few seconds a different one. So it's 100 trillion in one instant. We can start to become the opposite of my point would be, I'm not trying to say the human is, let's say, bigger than the universe, but the question, what is the human, seems to me has something like the scale of what is the cosmos. It's not that the human is bigger than the cosmos, but if we are not as uncertain of ourselves as we are of the cosmos, then I think we are just working with a kind of self-admiration. So for me, the point of the 100 trillion is to say we are a very, very fragile guest of this extraordinary community that has 4.5 billion years, which in terms of the universe is probably not a very big number. But in terms of us, it's an extraordinary number. But I mean, for me, it's just music to listen to your zeros.
We have another question here. If you can bring the microphone. Yeah. Blue jacket. Yeah.
So, my name is Konstantinos, and I have a comment to the panel. You criticize Doxiadis. I don't know very much about the theory, but I would like to criticize also you briefly. That means you spoke about well-being, that we don't know what it is, and I agree. So in Greek it is oidemonia, and it would be interesting to understand what it means for the people on Earth that were using this. And perhaps a circle like this or similar can contribute something. And I have not seen much about this, and I regret it. Secondly, I think settlements are very important because already now most humans live in big cities. So if we achieve to organize our life better in the big cities, then we make a big contribution for the future of humanity. And planning of cities is very important. And Doxiadis was really in contrast to Le Corbusier and the others. And this is very different life conception. And nobody spoke about this very clearly. I'm a little disappointed. I mean, this controversy between Le Corbusier and Doxiadis. And this is important for our well-being. Living in a brutalist city or living in a Doxiadis city. This is a difference. We should not make all level. So, and I hope this will get better tomorrow, really, that we understand more about what it is eudaimonia, what it means to live in a city in a way that is good for us, for our future, for the environment. And I'm hopeful about this.
No, thank you for bringing this into focus. I mean, of course, our desire is not to diminish the important, moment of Doxiadis, and that's why we spent the last 10 years with Simon bringing that into focus. And so I think that, we are very much aware of, that importance, and I think both Dimitris and Simon can speak to this, and I don't want to only take up the discussion space, but I think that we're just trying to bring some historical context of the discussion today also, and discussions are taking place contemporary in architecture and, more broadly outside, about thinking about how cleansing thinking about architecture is something that, in fact, Doxiadis didn't do, but, very much of his time. He was a genius in so many ways, but he was also, a product of his time, and that's the focus that we're bringing here. That historical depth. Simon, would you like to comment?
Yeah, on the question. Sorry. I'd like to know what well-being is as well, and Doxiadis and the Delos Symposia definitely did. And the thing that, as I said, I find most praiseworthy is that they attempted more deeply than any architectural movement or episode to delve into that. If you look at it now, discussions of well-being amongst architects and architectural consultants is often used interchangeably with productivity, right? You can tell when your office is well designed because your office workers are working hard. So, I often work hard. It doesn't mean I feel well. Right? The slaves being taken from here with the whips applied to their back were probably working very hard. It didn't give them necessarily say that they were experiencing well-being. So that is a slightly flippant response of the state of the discourse right now. But the Delos Symposia went into it and perhaps did, and they had their own sub theory of Ekistics. Ekistics, the science of human settlements, and Anthropics, the science of the people within the human settlements. So they put the person center in a way that's absolutely praiseworthy. The distinction between Korb and Doxiadis, I think, is not quite as clear cut. For sure, Doxiadis was interested in smaller scale settlements, in pedestrianization, that we would have small settlements which are walkable with amenities within convenient distances. And less reliance on the automobile, as we heard from Thomas living in Apollonian. But at the same time, he was very much within the Siam tradition of the architect planner as the expert, who would deliver those visions unto people. They would be provided to people and backed up by science, backed up by the latest technologies. Doxiadis was instituted in 1964, a thing called the DACC, the Doxiadis Associates Computer Center, which was the first, I believe, the first large-scale application of computing technology to architecture, certainly in Europe. So it was all still backed up by the same kinds of technologies and sort of hard data and the expert delivering it. So even though the solutions may have looked very different to the earlier Siam period and the Corbusier type megacities, multi-level transport, and rather communally spare cities, is still, I think, very much within that same slightly paternalistic tradition. Would you agree?
I think I need also to contextualize the SIAM, which is the International Congress of Modern Architecture that is taking place, and so on. So I think just for people who are not from the circle of architecture, that these are, I think Simon is trying to place that within that narrative of the 20th century, right? So of course he was different, but he was very much in that vein of thought. That's why we are trying to bring this historical understanding of that moment, right? So we recognize his singularity, but at the same time, we're placing him within this, development during the 20th century. And of course, we're bringing him also into focus in relation to current discussions or practices like Thomas's, own practice, or, the more, current thinking of that Mark is bringing, into focus and we'll be discussing tomorrow. I don't know how we're doing with time. It's 7:33. I'm asking the organizers, so 5 more minutes. We have another question. Please.
Yes, hello, thank you very much. I'm Christina Dalla, I'm a professor at the medical school, so totally different from architecture. First of all, psychiatrists, psychologists measure well-being. They have some scales that they measure. Of course, I don't know how accurate they are, but taking into consideration that mental health problems increase and they are supposed to increase more in the future, maybe we should start collaborating more. I know there is a trend to collaborate more with between architecture and psychology, psychiatry, sociologists to make something that could really help the well-being and mental health mainly. So that's, and I wanted to ask it from an historical perspective. What do you think? If it's if the cities nowadays really contribute to the mental health problems and the increase in that?
Dimitris has.
It was very nice that you asked this question, because one of many things we can't mention today in this meeting is that the close connection of Doxiadis with medicine. First of all, his father was a famous doctor. 2 of his brothers became also doctors, and all his documents are filled with expressions about the sickness of modern cities, about the ulcers, and all the metaphors that are used back and forth. And that wasn't just a figure of speech. It was more than anything else a deep belief that cities can be interpreted as beings, as human beings. And so a planner has the right to intervene like a doctor has. I mean, nobody asks a doctor whether he has a right to prescribe something. So a planner has the same right, and he is justified for intervening in the city, even destroying part of it, because you have to destroy something in order to restore something else. There are a lot of metaphors that go from that point on. And so this connection between the ailing body and the city, of course, did not start with Doxiadis. It was before him, but he took it over and expanded it. And I don't think that was, at the end, a wrong attitude, because a city has to be compared to something, has to be likened to something. It has to be called an organism, a being. And, there are all kinds of inconvenient metaphors, but you can't just call it a mixture of buildings, or a network by itself. But that's how do you express something that is alive? This is the important thing. And when Doxiadis came here and they signed the Declaration of Delos in 1963, this was dead as it is today, and it was again convenient because anybody could say anything about Delos and nobody would complain. It wasn't alive, it wasn't a city, it was a relic, it was history.
I just wanted to jump back on the cities thing. In a place like Delos, you could think about whether or not a city is a good idea. To assume that cities are good seems to me a big mistake. Cities are the engines of climate change. They are absolute engines of inequality. They are toxic. They do not produce mental well-being. In other words, a starting position could well be cities are not a good idea. Let's imagine something better. Maybe we start with cities that we love. Maybe there's a reason to come to Delos and see what we love, but let's just imagine we need a new concept. And if you look at the work of Doxiadis and his colleagues, and I think if you apply them directly to the present, it's a very big mistake, and it's a disrespect, because they are so sensitive to the ideas of their time and the concepts of their time. But all of Doxiadis' work is connected to a philosophy of growth. You see in all of his diagrams are images of growth. This is why he's very interested in biology and technology, and he's interested in people like McLuhan and Fuller, who thought that technology is biology. It is life itself. It is an organism. But I think in this moment of history, when we are burning the planet, and the vast majority of our planet live below the poverty level, and the vast majority of humans live in cities, we have every reason to suspect that the city is the problem, and we need maybe to come up with an alternative concept. I live in New York, so I'm by definition a city fan, but I might be somewhat criminal, and I speak as a person of great privilege. So I think it would be useful, at least, to allow ourselves, particularly architects, to consider the possibility that cities are not a good idea, that architecture is not a good idea, that architects are not a good idea, and search for, let's say, an alternative concept. And I think if you look at Doxiadis, why I admire him so much is I think you can understand his work in that spirit. He literally said, we need to come up with a completely alternative way of thinking, an alternative theory, a different sense of what is the scale, a different sense of what responsibility is. So when I complain, hey, maybe this emphasis on humans is ultimately part of the problem, when I complain that maybe growth is part of the problem, these are just, let's say, trying to behave as he behaved, which is to rethink. And if we would imagine now, who do we need? Who do we need? Maybe you need to be there. Maybe we start with mental health and we work from mental health. I'll give you another theory. What if all of our expertise is devoted to children between the ages of 0 and 3? That's it. We only concentrate on them, with the assumption that if we were to do that, pretty much everybody else will be okay. And by the way, they'll be more than okay because they were taken care of between the years of 0 and 3. For me, that's a... Now, if you say, are cities a good idea for children between 0 and 3? I don't know. Let's have the conversation.
Let's give the last question here.
Okay. So it's not a question, but I think I shouldn't stay silent here. In particular, Mark has provided a tsunami of provocations, very interesting. So it would take me all night to respond to it. But to a small remark and a bigger remark. The small remark is, you said there are no settlements beyond human settlements. No. I had a conversation with Francis Carré recently. He's a Pritzker Prize winner. We did a symposium on architecture in the Pontifical Academy in Rome, in the Vatican, and he shared with me a picture of a termite mound, you know, and he has created the Burkina Faso Institute of Technology, modeled after termite mounds, and you know, these are the best ventilated settlements in the world, really. There is even a paper in PNAS on that. I could elaborate on that tomorrow. So there are beehives, there are termite mounds and so on. These are fantastic settlements beyond human settlements. That is my small remark. The big remark is that is the city the problem? I will also talk about it tomorrow. Actually, the transformation of the built environment is actually precisely what can save this planet. And I can elaborate on that. It's just a different materiality, it's a different design, it's a different function. It's not the city we have to abolish, we have to abolish our, what you might call the post-Le Corbusier idea of the city. And this is precisely where we can go back to Doxiadis. So that is my value proposition. I will elaborate on that tomorrow.
I think this is the right moment to stop with these provocative thoughts and, you know, these, promises for tomorrow's discussion. And, our boat is waiting for us to take us to a wonderful dinner where we can continue the conversation and keep, feeding our minds with these thoughts and, moving on for tomorrow. Thank you.